He used a push button spin cast reel, but he held the rod with the reel underneath and he reeled it backwards and upside down.
Time for the Angler Within podcast with Roy Bilby. Good Lord, is it nice to see you, Roy Bilby.
Good to be back. I've been wrapping up visits in Bass Pro Shop stores, but you've been out of town yourself as well.
Yeah, I've been out for a while. Well, I mean, I'm in and out, but I haven't had any time to do anything with this beloved podcast. So thanks to everybody out there who's been patiently waiting. I say patient because nobody complained, but there was concern, which is nice, you know?
It is. I occasionally get direct messages saying, when's your next podcast? Because we were routinely putting them out once a week, but then with your schedule, you had no control over it and it changed.
No, I have a real job outside of this. So this sometimes takes a sidecar, but I was literally away from home. I was in the woods all summer, directing camp. So
yep.
Now I'm back and we are once again on our commitment to getting you one a week. Ish. 7 days is our usually the latest you're going to wait is like 10. But again, thank you for being with us this whole time. And you are more appreciated than you realize. And if you could, while we're speaking about that kind of stuff, give us a rating. If you could, preferably 5 stars would keep our string going. And, of course, if you think it deserves 5 stars, I have a biased opinion, as does Roy. But I think it's solid, and obviously you guys do too. So show us the love. Give us a subscribe and a 5-star rating.
And all the compliments and comments that I get through my DM are all positive. So again, tremendously appreciated. We just want to try to keep coming up with new and original material, stuff that's relative, that's relatable, and current. And what I'd like to talk about today is unique situations for bass baits that you may not think you would use for other species, as well as some obscure lures for bass that aren't even talked about anymore and haven't been talked about for about 30 years. And then after that, I want to shift gears and talk bait casting gear because I talk to a lot of people about it and I try to explain the nuances. A lot of people are reluctant to pick up a bait caster, or they blew it up in a horrible bird's nest and it remains in their closet forever, and they relegate themselves to spinning gear, even though they would really like to throw bait cast gear. They just don't think they can. And that is not true. Anybody can learn how to use it.
Which makes it both feared and revered.
And the thing is, if you got your mind made up that you can't use it, well, in that case, you're probably right. Consider my son, when he was 10 years old, he was proficient with bait casting gear. 10 years old, because nobody told him he couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I just gave him an outfit and said, try this, and here's how you do it. And he picked it right up. 10 years old. So I know kids that were using it since they were 5. So what's a spin cast? What's a 202? They didn't even know that. So anybody can do it. And on the second half of this, we'll get into discussing that, and I'll give you some tricks and tips that you can use to warm yourself up to a bait caster and get out there using them, because I'm way more accurate with a bait caster than I am with a spinning rod. Way, way more. And it took me a while to learn how to use them. And anybody can do it. So let's get into it. Years ago, I would fish a lake in our region, 2,000 surface acres, nice lake, good largemouth, good smallmouth, walleye, tiger muskie, just phenomenal panfish populations. It's a good lake to fish for anything, and you can target good species there, but it has a good, healthy population. We've won bass tournaments there. Our club goes there once every 3 years or so, and other clubs go there, and I've competed in those. It's one of the lakes that I cut my teeth on when I first got my first bass boat back in 1990. But an interesting thing about the walleye fishery there, they do something, and this happens in other places too. But this is where I learned about it and discovered it quite entirely and surprisingly on my own. I was actually fishing for bass, and we had a warm front move in. It was, midsummer like this, and here comes all these clouds rolling. It didn't rain, and we got off the lake ahead of the rain. When it really got black, we said, "Here it comes." We headed for the launch, but we had a good 2 hours before that. I mean, this was a slow moving front. It just got entirely overcast, and the wind kicked up, and we got a pretty good chop on the surface. And if you've listened to our podcast before, that's when I pick up a spinnerbait, because those are spinnerbait conditions. And we got in about 6 to 8 foot of water, where there was a little bit of water above this submerged grass, about a 2 foot section of water above the where the grass was topped out. And I'm throwing this spinnerbait, and I get hammered, and I pull in, surprise, a walleye. What is a walleye doing hitting a spinnerbait? I caught a limit doing that, covering water, before the skies got really black and pushed us off, and we headed to the launch and rolled out. And I wrote that in my journal that day, saying, and this is back in the, good grief, probably mid 90s. I'm like, what an unusual occurrence today. Little did I know that I would go on to duplicate that event 3 other times in the next couple years, when we had similar conditions where a front blew in, it got really overcast, but it wasn't raining yet. And I'd head to those grass flats with my spinnerbait, and the walleye were there, just crushing a spinnerbait. And one time, in fact, I had a guy from work that worked with us at the construction company back in those days when I was doing heavy construction. And his father-in-law had a bass tracker boat and loved to fish that lake for walleye. But he said his father-in-law fished one spot, and that was in front of this one beach. And he would just go out there and anchor right in front of the center of that beach, and he would just fish. And sometimes they caught walleye, sometimes they didn't. And that's how they walleye fished, with live bait. And I mean, some days they caught them, but he said he would never go anywhere else. He just went to that one spot because that's where he had found him at one point. And I guess that's what he put all his eggs in that basket. And this guy, Steve, was telling me, well, I've walleye fished this lake, but we do it kind of different than you do, because I was running all over the lake. But lo and behold, that day, Steve caught his best walleye ever. And he was like, I got to tell my father-in-law he needs to move his boat and look for fish. I said, they're throughout the whole lake. You just got to work at finding them. Well, as we're fishing, as fate would have it, starts to get cloudy, starts to get overcast. Breeze kicks up, and leaves start turning up on the trees. He goes, I think we're going to get hit with some rain. I said, well, I got a little walleye trick up my sleeve before the rain comes. I said, we need to head to the upper end where we got the grass flats. He goes, oh, where we were fishing for bass this morning? I said, yeah, but I'm going to give you a spinnerbait to put on your rod, and we're going to catch some walleye. And he said, not on a spinnerbait, that's a bass lure. I said, hey, trust me on this. And we went up there and started flinging spinnerbaits, and we caught a limit of walleye, and big ones and good ones. He just couldn't believe it. I said, I've done this before. It's a pattern that has repeated itself. Well, why would they hit a bass lure? Why would they hit a spinnerbait? And I said, think about it. You got those blades flashing. What do walleye chow down on? Bait fish, other fish, small, young of the year sport fish. And you got those blades flashing. It simulates a fish. You got to understand, walleye have superior vision when the light is diminished, especially at night. There's two factors that contribute to in our eyes and in their eyes. They're made up of rods and cones, and walleye have a lot more of the one that gives you good vision when the light is diminished. Ours is the other way. where we see really good in daylight, but when it gets dark, we grab a flashlight because our eyes don't adjust to that diminished light. But walleye, of all the fish that are out there, have superior night vision and do a lot of their feeding at night. But when you get a front that comes in and you get overcast and you get that chop on the surface that distorts whatever light is getting through, the skies are dark, it's like early evening and it triggers a feed in the walleye. And this is why so many people, when they go walleye fishing, they go in the evening and they go at night. When the sun first goes down and you lose that daylight like an hour or so later, there's a window, a 2 hour feed most evenings when that night vision of theirs comes into play. In our region here in the Northeast, one of the predominant bait fish or young of the year fish that make up the walleye diet is young perch. Perch have our vision. They have very poor night vision. So fish don't sleep, but they go into periods of rest. And when it gets dark at night, perch aren't active. They just go down and they suspend either a foot off the bottom, belly to the bottom. They get close to the bottom. They orient themselves to something and they just hang. They don't sleep, but they just go dormant. And what walleye do, they're like perch vacuums. They can see all this stuff. Perch have no clue. They come up behind them and they just vacuum them up, and the perch don't know it until it's too late. That's why when I walleye fish at night, if I'm throwing crankbaits, I'll find a hump or something that's like comes within 5-6 foot of the surface, and I'll grab a square bill that goes down 4 or 5 foot, even a little deeper, and I'll bang bottom with it and draw attention. I use a perch pattern, and the walleye, good grief, they crush those at night. They just like they see it coming. They back up and they get a head start and they hit it so hard about yanks the rod out of your hand. And those are amazing strikes from a fish that everybody says doesn't fight. Well, yes, they do. They fight tremendous, especially when you hook a big one at night. So the whole point here was spinner baits for walleye. I mean, this all happened years ago, and then I got so heavily involved with bass tournaments that my walleye fishing suffered. I haven't done much walleye fishing on that lake in, good grief, a long time. That 1 3 year stretch I had where I hit every full moon, we had some tremendous nights on that lake. But they have had some trouble recently where they had too many walleye were harvested despite the stocking efforts, and they reduced it to a 3 fish limit with an 18-inch length limit to try to build the population back up. And that's still we're still under that mandate for that lake. It's a special regulation. You can, instead of 5, you can only keep 3, and instead of 15 inches, they have to be 18. And that'll just allow more walleye to get to that size and the breeding population increase, and they'll self-sustain. Plus, with the stocking efforts, we should eventually get back up to the normal 5 fish limit and 15-inch length. Oneida Lake as well. Oneida is a lake in the northern central part of the state, and not too far from Erie and those. Not too far, but it's a good distance from where I live. And they had the same problem with the walleye there. They went to a 3 fish 18-inch size. And I know guys, I mean, it's 2.5 hours from my house. And I got a guy that's a walleye addict, and he'll go out there to ice fish, catches 3 walleye, and drive all the way back home and turn right around and do it the next day. And good for him. I'm looking for open water when everybody else is ice fishing. I do love to ice fish, but if I can find open water, I'll be on that. So do not be afraid to try a spinnerbait with overcast conditions when you got a front blowing in for walleye. It does work. And once you know, just a year after I discovered that pattern, In Fisherman Magazine came out with an article on using spinner baits for walleye. And I'm like, no, don't tell everybody. I was keeping this a dirty little secret and sharing it with just a few people. But as I mentioned earlier, just today I had a young guy out. He came to watch my presentation at Bass Pro Shops, and I know his dad. We're good friends. We belong to a civic organization together, and his son is 21 years old. And he told me, man, he's discovered fishing. I got to bring him out when you're in the store, because him and his buddy boy, he said they fish like 3-4 days a week. They're just eating up with it. And I said, I can relate. So I let him know when I was called out to the Bass Pro in Utica, New York, and he brought those guys out. They sat through two of my presentations, and I do them an hour apart. They'd not been in a Bass Pro Shops before, and it was like two kids in a candy store. And the young guy I took out in my boat today on the river, he was asking about a bait caster, and his buddy was trying to get him, just do it, pull the trigger, buy one. And he's asking me, well, what should I get? And the best advice I can give somebody who wants to get into using a bait caster is be very careful. Don't buy a cheap one, but by all means don't drop $250 on the best reel you can find that has 10, 11 ball bearings, because they are so smooth. They're more for, I would say, and I might get some grievance on this, but they're more designed for experienced users because they are so smooth. They're incredibly easy to backlash if you don't know how to tune them or how to use them. And I advised him, find a good reel with a good name that has like 5 ball bearings, 6 ball bearings. It's a good mid-grade. Learn on that because it'll be a little bit more forgiving because it's not quite as smooth. And I have 3 tips that I give people with a bait casting reel, and I to make the casting better and avoid backlash.
Write these down.
It's easier if I have a reel and can show it to people. But on the right, if you're right or left-handed, whichever side of the reel that your handle is on, there's a star mechanism, star-shaped dial that's right behind the reel handle. That's your drag. That controls how much line the fish can pull out against pressure with a loaded rod. And that has nothing to do with preventing backlashes. What does is the little dial, there's a little knob, a round knob right next to that. That is called your spool tension knob. That controls the amount of tension on the spool. That is your casting control, people. And what you need to do is tune the reel to whatever bait you're going to throw, because some are quarter ounce, some are eighth, some are half ounce. So you tie on whatever bait you're going to throw, and you take that knob and you turn it clockwise until you can't turn it any farther. And then you hold your rod out parallel to the ground, arm's length, and you hit the release on your spool and let go of it. That bait's not going to move. Now, because your spool is locked down by that spool tension knob, now you start backing off the spool tension counterclockwise in little tiny increments, very slowly, just a little at a time. And when that bait starts to drop down to the ground under its own weight, stop turning. The reel is tuned for that weight of lure. Now you can make a cast, and when your bait hits the water, your spool will stop turning. There's another dial on many reels. It's a magnetic cast control. It's a dial that's numbered, 1 through 10, or they'll have other ways of marking them, but usually it's a 1 through 10 dial. And that is, and on most reels, it's a magnetic cast control. Your spool is aluminum to reduce weight, but the shaft, the arbor that it rotates on, is made of steel in almost all reels. When you're starting to fish, you want to crank that right up to the highest setting. That draws magnets, typically 8 magnets, around the arbor of that spool. Dialed down to 1 or 0, they are at the farthest point away from it. But as you dial it up, each click, they inch closer and closer and closer to the center of that spool, closer to that steel arbor, and they create magnetic tension on it. That's what the spool tension knob is for, to control and put a lot of tension on that centrifugal force. The other dial on the opposite side of your reel, where you have the numerical increments 1 through 10, sometimes they're 10 through 100, it's all the same. That is used as a minimal adjustment. Do not rely on that solely for backlash control. That's what your spool tension knob does, as I explained earlier. And how to tune it by setting your reel to the weight of the lure. What that number dial is for, what I use it for, is if I have my spool all set and tuned for the weight of the jig or whatever lure I'm throwing, you crank that up if you have to cast into the wind. If where your targets are, the direction of the wind that day, if you can't have the wind at your back and you have to throw into the wind, that's a recipe for disaster with a bait caster. You can do it with a spinning reel all day long, but with a bait caster throwing into the wind, that's what that numbered dial is for. on the offside of your reel opposite your handle. And that's what I use it for.
Based on the wind?
Yeah, the only time I really rely on that numerical dial is if I have to throw into the wind, because it puts magnetic force on that steel arbor. If you crank it right up to 10, those magnets draw right into the center, really close to that steel arbor, and they will put a little bit of magnetic force slowing down that centrifugal force. But you always have your trusty thumb too. If you can educate yourself to let that thumb glide on the spool, if your lure touches down before you want it to, you just pinch that spool with your thumb, and that's your best break. Time and experience will educate your thumb. So the spool tension knob is the first ingredient in tuning your reel, preventing a backlash. That numerical dial on the offside of your reel is the number 2 thing you can use to help prevent a backlash. It's a secondary adjustment. The third one is, I see most people, they want to take the rod in their hand, point it towards the target, and then just wind up directly over the head and throw overhand, right overhead. And more often than not, when they're starting, that bait lands splash in the water right at their feet, and their reel unloads all their line, and they got a monster backlash. Something that will really, really help. It's hard to explain this without showing you, but if you take your rod and you point it at your target with the spool upright, with your reel upright, and then you just rotate. I'm right-handed, so I'm holding my rod, pointing it straight at the target. If you rotate it 90 degrees, a quarter turn, so that the reel handle is upward and the palm side of the reel is facing down, and you cast that way, you're still making an overhand cast, but your reel is on its side instead of sitting horizontally. Now your reel is sitting vertically, and it just helps feed the line off better. And most people, when they cast that way, they have a tendency to not release their thumb from the spool mid-cast a little too late. That is, for some reason, that's the natural tendency. When people start casting with a bait caster and just do an overhead cast with that spool horizontal, there's a tendency, for whatever reason, to release a little too late, and that bait lands right at the water at their feet, and they get a monster backlash because they expected to launch at 100 feet, and it goes a foot and lands. If you turn that reel and rod so that the reel is vertical, with the reel handles up and the palm side down, so the reel is more or less on its side, let's say, and you make an overhead cast, it seems to fly out there a lot better. Those are the 3 things that you can do, and the 3 things I do all the time when I started learning to use a bait caster without getting a backlash. Once you get comfortable with the equipment, all that stuff can pretty much go out the window, save for using the spool tension knob to adjust your reel. And I still mess with mine all the time, depending on what lures I'm throwing. But I can do sidearm cast, backhand cast, left hand, right hand cast, overhead, sidearm, underhand, backhand. It doesn't matter. I'm just so comfortable with the bait casting equipment. Now, case in point, the Carbon Light series that I use from Bass Pro Shops for my tournament competitions. I have 13 Carbon Lights in my tournament arsenal. That's what I call it. But I have 10 of them are bait casters, and only 3 are spinning rods. I like using spinning rods, but in a largemouth situation, I hardly ever, and this is just me, this is my preference for lures. Some people like to throw a spinner bait on a spinning rod. I can't do it. I have to throw it on a bait caster because I can control where it goes. I can control how I work it around objects. It's just much more natural and comfortable for me with a bait caster. That's what I've become accustomed to. But when I largemouth fish, all the techniques that I use for largemouth, a Texas rig plastic worm, a Carolina rig, a spinner bait, a crankbait, a topwater, a chatterbait, all the things that I use for largemouth, even a Senko, I throw them on bait casting gear because that's what I'm comfortable presenting those techniques with, presenting those baits with. But that's me. I see a lot of people, most people throw a Senko with a spinning rod, but it doesn't feel right to me.
Well, you're talking to an hombre who likes to use a 7-foot medium fast with a 300 spinning reel on it. I got 2 of them.
And you're one of the guys I've seen throwing it on a spinning rod. Most people do. I don't see very many people throw a Senko on a bait caster, save for myself. Now, you want to talk smallmouth techniques. For me, half my smallmouth fishing is done with spinning rods. The techniques I use a spinning rod for, and I'm talking bass fishing now. I'm not talking walleye or pan fishing or anything like that. When I'm pan fishing, it's strictly spinning rods, but that's my ultralight fishing. And I have I talked about them before. I use the Bass Pro Shops Micro Elite panfish rods. I love those. They're amazing. But I only use spinning tackle when I'm pan fishing. I don't use bait cast gear for perch, crappie, and bluegill. So in that regard, I use strictly spinning equipment. But getting back to the bass fishing, the smallmouth, I throw a tube on a spinning rod. I throw a Ned rig on a spinning rod, and I throw a drop shot on a spinning rod. That's it. If I'm throwing a grub or a jig for smallmouth, I'm throwing it on bait cast gear because that's what feels right to me. I've got a buddy who uses mostly spinning equipment, but he throws a tube on a bait caster, and that it just feels odd to me. And that's because I've always thrown one on a spinning rod. But again, to each their own. The 21-year-old that I took out fishing, he was apologizing for having a left-handed bait caster, and I said, "Hey, it doesn't matter. They make them right-handed and left-handed because everybody's different." My son's basically left-handed. He's ambidextrous, but he does a lot of things. He does more things left-handed than he does right-handed. Unfortunately for him, he grew up in a household where dad used right-handed bait casters, and he was proficient with a bait caster at 10 years old because of who his dad was and where he grew up. That was just, this is what's available. And he had good equipment handed to him at a very early age. So he learned with good equipment, good mid-grade stuff, and he got proficient with bait casting gear. And the handle was on the right-hand side. So he's a lefty using right-handed bait caster. But for him, he puts all his spinning reel handles on the wrong side of the reel, to my way of thinking. There's no right or wrong way. That's why they make them both ways, spinning reels and bait casting reels, because everybody's different and everybody has to use what suits them and feels right to them, or it's going to affect your fishing. I took a guy fishing one time who wanted a fishing lesson. He used a push button, a spin cast reel, but he held the rod with the reel underneath and he reeled it backwards and upside down. Now, full disclosure, this guy was from Australia. Well, I said, well, that makes sense. He's holding the reel down under, and that's what he did. He held it upside
Are you
down.
being punny right now? Is that a pun?
I'm being punny. He's from Australia.
Did he actually do this? Did he actually do that, or are you just making it up because he was from Australia?
No, he actually did that. And okay. I'm like, holy cow, I see why he wants fishing lessons. But at the time, he was one of the bosses where I worked. So I didn't feel I needed to correct the boss, that's the way he'd always done it. And he brought it up. He saw how I held mine. I'm using bait casters, but he held his upside down and reeled it inside out and backwards.
Interesting.
And he caught a few fish, but good grief. I don't even know if I could do that if I tried, but that's how he learned.
So question, you got a guy like me who is I've been born and raised spin caster. Okay. But I want to get into bait casting. I walk into Bass Pro and I am immediately overwhelmed by all the options that are rocking there. But I know in the back of my mind that typically in my experience, if you go with a combo, you're usually getting a really good rod with a not so good reel on it. So
sometimes yes, sometimes no. It all depends. But that's a lot of the times it seems to be that's the case.
So what am I looking for when I walk in there? For somebody, I don't want bottom of the road. I don't want junk, but I want something that's halfway decent to learn on to go up from. That's not going to be laughed at when I'm out there learning how to use it either. You know what I mean?
Nope.
So it's
the young guy that I took out on Tuesday. I think he dropped like $120, $105, something like that for a Lew's bait casting combo. It was a red rod. It was the rod I was impressed with. It was a medium action, 7 foot, 10 guides, nice action to it. And the reel was really smooth. It was a mid-grade. I think he said it had 6 ball bearings and he was casting He was casting with it like crazy.
What was the
He
line he
was
was using? Did he have braid on there, or was he rocking fluoro or mono?
he had mono on it. I would recommend that to someone starting out as well. Just start out with mono. Do yourself a favor. You will be picking out a lot of backlashes, and with braid, that can be a nightmare. It really can. It all depends on the technique. I use mono on those 10 bait casters. 5 of them are sporting monofilament in different line diameters. I always use ultra low vis green trilene in my tournaments. That's what I always use. Trilene XT. XT stands for extra tough. It's made for bait casting reels. But 3 of them, I'm using the Bass Pro Shops XPS fluorocarbon, and a couple of them I'm using my heavy braid. I have a 7-foot medium heavy. That's my frog rod. That's got 50-pound braid on it. And I use that for using frog on top of cheese mats and stuff like that, cross pads, heavy grass. But that also doubles as a Carolina rig rod with a monofilament leader. I don't use fluorocarbon for a leader on that. Everybody envisioned the Carolina rig with your bait, floating off the bottom. Unless you have a very buoyant plastic like some of the Z-Man stuff, it's not. It's going to lay right on the bottom, especially with fluorocarbon that sinks. But if you use mono, which doesn't sink, it'll float. It'll actually help suspend that bait a little bit, especially if you use one of the more buoyant plastic. And then I have another 7-foot carbon light medium heavy action that has 30-pound braid on that. And then I use that for my chatterbait rod, but it also doubles as a Carolina rig rod if I have a frog rigged on the 50-pound braid. So those are the 2 rods I have the braid on. My crankbait rod is a 7-foot medium action, and I have 12-pound fluorocarbon on that. Fluorocarbon sinks. It helps get your crankbaits down as deep as the manufacturer says they'll run. And it's 0 stretch, so you get positive hook sets. I also run 12-pound fluorocarbon, XPS fluorocarbon, on my 2 Texas rig rods, and they are both 7-foot medium action carbon lights, and that's what I run on those for my Texas rigging. The monofilament is used. I have 1 7-foot for spinner baits with 14-pound mono on it. I've got 2 6.5-foot medium heavies for pitching jigs. One has 15-pound mono, one has 20 or 17-pound mono. And then I have 2 6.5-foot medium action carbon lights that have 10-pound monofilament on them for using my grubs and stuff like that for smallmouth. For my lighter 1/4-ounce jig heads for using a grub or a craw or anything of that nature, just a ball head jig, running a chigger craw, anything like that. Those are my bait casters. The spinning rods, I've got 2 7-foot 2-inch medium action spinning rods. Medium action because I'm using them strictly for smallmouth, and those are my tube rod and my Ned rig rod, and then I have a 6-foot 3-inch medium light, which I use for a drop shot. They all have carbon light reels on them. The bait cast reels, I use a super fast, like an 8-3-to-1 retrieve for the frog rod and the Carolina rig rod, just because it also doubles as a frog rod. And if I need to get my bait out of there quick and make another pitch, it makes it more efficient. The rest of them have like a 7-2-to-1, 7-3-to-1 retrieve, which is pretty fast. I mean, I grew up with reels that a 5-to-1 ratio was a fast reel, and now they hardly even make them like that anymore. Those are the slow reels that people use for crankbaits. When I was doing it, a crankbait reel was a 3.8-to-1, and it's crazy how the gear ratios have changed with time.
A couple years back, I bought an Abu Garcia combo.
Yeah, they're a good quality.
Yeah, it was
good
great.
quality.
And then I ended up returning it because I was convinced it was broken because I kept on backlashing. I just brought it back to Walmart and gave it back to him. I threw it back.
Yeah, there was nothing wrong with the combo, just so you know.
Just me. It wasn't the arrow. It was the Indian, as they say.
Yeah, that's
or indigenous person. Sorry.
Yeah.
Indigenous person.
Yeah. Good analogy.
But anyway, well, listen, what a great chat about bait casters. And for all
I
you
hope
out
it helps somebody out there.
For all you out there, if you have a question about bait casting or anything else in life, slide into Roy's DMs over at all lowercase Roy Bilby. And please continue, if you haven't already done so, give us a rating, a 5-star rating if you think we're worth it. I think we are. Give us a 5-star rating over on Spotify and help us along. Give us a subscribe too.
I'll tell you what, I've got to give a shout out to my buddy John Apino and his girlfriend Allison. They traveled all the way from New Jersey 2 hours to Bridgeport, Connecticut to meet me when I did my weekend at the Bridgeport store doing tank demos and mini seminars on the lures I was presenting in the tank. He messaged me. He follows our podcast. JD, he has not missed an episode. I think he found out about the podcast last March when I was in that store. He happened to catch my last demo. This is the backstory. I didn't know about any of this. He caught my final tank demo for the day, enjoyed it, and then he saw I had an Instagram card up there. He started following me on Instagram that day, and he noticed I had a board up there announcing our podcast and have the QR code there, which he scanned. They listened to the podcast on the way home for the very first time. He became a fan. He's not missed a single episode. He told me, we listened to your podcast on the way home. And I said, hey, this guy knows his stuff. He became, I think, our biggest fan. He's never missed an episode. He's the one that messaged me and said he believes he's catching bigger and more bass this year because of what he's learning on the podcast, which, John, I tremendously appreciate that. And buddy, I appreciate you, man. So thanks for coming to Bridgeport all the way, 2 hours there, 2 hours back to meet me. And the benefit goes both ways. I got to meet you. That was the best part of my day that day. So we got our pictures taken together, and he's a great guy. We talked for an hour. I didn't realize we were talking that long. They're announcing on the store PA that I'm going to be doing a live demo in 5 minutes. I'm like, holy cow, we've been talking for an hour. I got to get back up there.
I don't think you and I have ever had a short phone conversation either.
I don't think we have either. Yeah. You know, anyway. I got 3 lungs when I start talking about fishing. I use those 3 lungs to put out as much useful information as I can to help everybody out there do their best to tap into their angler within.